Okay, so we're now back, and we're in the middle of talking about the question of what Hamlet's true state of mind is, or is it really a very confused and possibly even unanswerable question? You know, to what extent can we try to arrive at some sensible conclusion to this question? What do you think? Any thoughts about that? Yeah, well, go ahead.
There's the great line where he's talking to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who are kind of spying on him, and he says, when the king and queen are deceived, I'm but mad north by northwest. When the wind blows southerly, I can tell a hawk from a handsaw. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not really crazy. Mm-hmm. You know, mm-hmm. he pretty much flat out tells them. Yeah, okay, okay.
But I don't know if any of you have ever been around disturbed people. You know, I was in the medical service in the Army, and the second time that I was called into the United States Army, I was in one time and then got called back a second time. I was assigned to work with a psychiatrist. And some of the patients that we dealt with were either mildly disturbed or sometimes very seriously disturbed. And then I also, after that, worked in civilian hospitals and clinics and so forth for a while in my checkered career. You know, some people who are really very disturbed know that they are very seriously disturbed and they seek help. But some people really don't know that they're disturbed. And that's part of their problem. Because there's this constant denial. Oh, you know, I'm not crazy. You know, it's the people around me who are crazy, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, without getting too far off into that, you know, one could bring up the counter-argument to what you just said, that while Hamlet is saying in the speech that you just referred to and elsewhere, that he's not really mentally unbalanced or disturbed, that may be precisely one of the reasons why we would say he is seriously disturbed. Because after all, look at his behavior in a number of scenes. And let's take that. Did you have something you were going to add to that? Yeah, please do.
I was just going to say, I would probably lean toward the fact that he probably wasn't very disturbed. And I would say that because of the amount that he analyzed, him being disturbed and analyzed what happened. I think that most people who are disturbed, even if they do realize that they're disturbed, they don't analyze what happened in quite such a reasonable way as he does. I don't think they understand the facts maybe as clearly as he does.
That's a very interesting point, because he obviously is a very skillful analyst of his own feelings and of his own psychological disposition. That's true. That's a good point.
Well, and he's also very in control of himself. I mean, he says, you know, don't tell them, you know, if I act this way, it's because I don't want him to suspect anything because of what may happen later. And if he's able to predict his behavior in the future and where this is going to lead to, I would say that would be the mind of a pretty rational individual.
Okay. Well, that's a very interesting line of reasoning. Well, let's put this to the test by actually thinking about a couple of scenes. And the first scene that I'm talking about is the scene in which Polonius is meeting with Claudius and Gertrude. And he says, oh, listen, you know, your son has a very, very serious problem. I mean, a really, really serious problem. And I think that he is mad, and I think that it is love which has driven him mad, which of course is kind of a silly cliche. But Polonius in some ways is kind of a silly person too. But in any event, he offers in part as evidence that according to his daughter, Ophelia, Polonius says, when she told him about this, that Hamlet came into her room and he behaved in this very, very strange way. You know, his clothes were sort of in disarray. He is staring into space. He's just acting in a very odd way, and she knew him very well. I mean, how well did she know him? What do we know about the kind of relationship that they had? I mean, how close was their relationship? How intimate even was their relationship? Do we have any evidence? What comes up in the graveyard scene in Act 5, Scene 1? Gertrude actually makes a comment about this. Anybody
says
remember
that
that?
she thought that they would marry. That
Right.
was her assumption.
That's right. That they were so close and so intimate with one another that Gertrude, and presumably others as well, might well have expected that they would get married. Right? Okay, now that's an interesting point. By the way, Branagh, in his version of the play, actually has these very quick cuts in which he shows the two of them in bed together. I mean, actually having sex together. I mean, it's not like some big sex scene, I don't mean that, but it's, you know, just very, very brief cuts, which are intercut with other materials, with other shots. And so it's very clear that what Branagh is indicating is that they not only had an intimate relationship, but an intimate sexual relationship. Well, then we come back to the scene in which Polonius says, okay, you know, your son is really mad, and he reads the letter, you know, that's filled with all of these romantic cliches. And he's making stylistic comments about that. And Gertrude says to him, more matter with less art. And so finally, Polonius convinces Claudius and Gertrude that they should have some kind of a test to find out if indeed Hamlet is mad, and if indeed it is love which has driven him mad. And so Polonius says, I'll loose my daughter on him. I'll loose my daughter on him. So they set up a scene in which she's walking in a hall, and now Claudius and Polonius are going to be behind, I mean, in the original, it's behind an arras, which is a kind of tapestry. But obviously, if you're going to set that in more recent times, that's going to be some other device. Branagh comes up with a very interesting device, by the way. But then Hamlet is going to come in, and they are going to be in hiding and observing his behavior towards Ophelia to find out if he is mad, A, and B, if it is love which has driven him mad. So how does he behave towards Ophelia in that scene? Does anybody remember how he behaves towards Ophelia? So
He's mean to her.
yeah, he is mean to her. He's very.
After she tries to return the things that he's given to her, letters and whatnot.
Yeah, but he's really, really, really. I mean, the word mean is really kind of an understatement. I mean, he's really, really harsh towards her. And then when he says to her, you know, get thee to a nunnery go, what do you think that means? Does anybody know what does that line mean? There were people who used the word nunnery at that time as a slang term, not simply for a convent of nuns, but for what? A house of prostitutes. Okay, so I mean, he's really giving it to her. I mean, he's very hard on her, and he talks about how women can, deceive men and get out of my sight. And the way this is actually played in some cases is he'll even throw her down. I mean, watch the Olivier version or watch the Branagh version. And he's actually physically violent. I mean, it doesn't hit her with a fist or anything like that, but he's actually quite physical with her. And Mel Gibson is in the Zeffirelli version too, quite physical with her. Okay, so my point here is, what does that tell us really about Hamlet and Hamlet's mental stability or madness? What's at issue here? Any thoughts about that? Claudius is not convinced. He says, this is not love. His feelings do not that way tend. What's at stake here? One of the things that is at stake is, he answers his own question. One of the things at stake here is the issue of whether or not he knows that he's being spied on. Does he know or does he not know that he is being spied on? If he knows that he's being spied on by Claudius and Polonius, when he supposedly is there all alone with Ophelia, whom he should be able to trust, and with whom he obviously has a very intimate relationship, if he thinks that this is all a trap and he's being spied on, then his behavior toward her makes a lot of sense. I mean, he's really, really mean towards her. He insults her, as this is actually put on stage or film. Sometimes he'll even push her down on the floor. Now, does he or does he not know? I mean, that's very interesting. In the Olivier version, Olivier stages that in such a way that Hamlet sees the two of them go behind the arras. And so a lot of the time, he actually points towards the place where he knows that they are hiding. But that's not in the text of the play. I mean, I defy anybody to pick up the play and find evidence that Hamlet actually knows. Okay? That is an interpretation of the scene. That's not something which is simply there. Okay? In the Branagh version, yeah, did you have a comment to make on that?
I was just going to say, whether he knows or not that he's getting spied on, he still knows that his sanity is in question, and he knows that his life is in danger, and that can be a really major driving force. And he knows that everybody's against him, and that his actions at this point, can be the life or death of him. And he's apparently a really smart man and a good actor up to this point. So. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. That's a very good observation. And he has, in the past, as we heard earlier from Polonius, he has in the past acted very strangely and very much out of character around her. Okay? We're going to see other instances where if people act very much out of character, that is taken as a sign that they are mad. As Ophelia in her so-called mad scene. Okay? Yeah.
Well, plus, he's whether or not he's crazy, he's very dedicated to making himself seem as though he's crazy to accomplish what he wants to accomplish, and using Ophelia is obviously not beyond him, which is sort of a Machiavellian thing, sort of too, which kind of makes sense later when she is dead, how upset he is about that, that he sort of regrets having used her.
Yeah, yeah. How about Branagh? Let's see, you saw the Branagh version? Have you seen that
I
scene
haven't
yet?
finished the whole thing yet. So
Have you seen that scene, though?
yes.
Her mad scene.
Okay.
Oh no. I'm sorry. No, not her.
No,
mad scene.
I'm not talking about Ophelia's mad scene. I'm talking about the scene in which Ophelia is being used to try to trap Hamlet. Do you remember how that's handled in Branagh's version?
As far as whether or not he knows
Yeah.
that they're there.
And how does he act towards her?
It's all those two-way mirrored doors,
Right.
and he
Right.
hears something,
Right.
and he goes and he's dragging her around.
Right.
He's holding onto her and kind of throwing her down. At the same time, he's opening all those doors, and he shoves her up against
Right.
the one door where they're at, and they turn it around. You can see the view from their
Okay.
point, from their view, where she's smashed up against the glass, and then they run and escape before he gets into the door. So
And what happens at the very end of that scene? How does he behave toward her? Is it still violent, angry, or does he become
no,
tender?
she's sitting down like in the door.
Okay,
jam.
but does he become tender towards her?
I think isn't the last thing he says to her, "Get thee to the nunnery" or something?
Yeah, but
he's quiet. He's
Yeah,
not.
go ahead. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. He's much more tender towards her than, say, Olivier is in his version. Now, Mel Gibson, we haven't really talked about that version very much. That's a very interesting version of Hamlet, by the way. I talked a little bit about Zeffirelli in an earlier class when I was talking about directors. But Mel Gibson is an interesting casting choice because clearly what Zeffirelli is trying to do is to distance himself from that romantic version of Hamlet that you find in Olivier, that he is too sensitive a soul. That's what Goethe said, the great German poet said back in the 18th century about Hamlet. He is too sensitive, too fine a soul, a sensibility for the situation in which he finds himself. And that is why he is brought to his tragedy in the end. Well, that pretty much is the way in which Olivier plays the character of Hamlet as the romantic Hamlet, the romantic hero. So, and again, I don't mean romantic in the sense of hug, hug, kiss, kiss. I'm talking about romantic in the sense of romanticism. Now, why choose Mel Gibson? Because Mel Gibson had a reputation, right, in his earlier films. He was in all those adventure action films. So you pick somebody like that and put him in Hamlet as Hamlet, and part of what you are saying to the audience is, this is a very different kind of Hamlet. He is tough. He is a man of action, or certainly somebody who's capable of action. And we see Mel Gibson a number of times in a number of scenes being very much a man of action. Okay? Notice that that too is an interpretation of the play. Again and again and again, we keep coming back to the fact that what we've got here is we've got words on a page. We've got script for a play, but we don't have a play. We only have a play when that is performed, when it's actually put in production. Now, if you're skillful enough at it and thoughtful enough, you can, in effect, produce it in your own head. Well, this is what I would do. This is how I would stage it. Okay, but normally what we mean by a production is something which is actually produced on stage, or in the cases that we've been talking about on film. Okay, so let's go back then to the scene, the Get Thee to a Nunnery Go scene. And so see what is at stake here? The question of whether or not Hamlet knows that he's being spied on and that this is an effort to trap him is a way of attempting to resolve the problem of his harshness, even meanness, even violence towards her. Okay? So that if you have him knowing that he's being spied on, it makes it easier for us to accept Hamlet being as hard on her as he is. So that in the Branagh version, you're right, he actually hears a door close. And when he hears that door close, he knows, aha, you see, there's somebody else here. We are not alone. I'm being set up. Okay? In the Olivier version, he actually sees them there, going back there. Okay, so that's one kind of scene that we would want to talk about, because it clearly has to do with issues about Hamlet, his relationship not only with Ophelia, but the question of madness and so forth. Now let's consider another scene. What about the scene with his mother, the so-called closet scene? And you will recall what I said earlier about the word closet. At this time, it didn't mean what we mean by our closets in our homes, a small enclosure where we hang our clothes. It meant an enclosed space within a house, or in this case, apparently a castle. But it's really her bedroom. So, what happens in that scene? What happens in the so-called closet scene? Well, you haven't gotten there yet, huh? Well, it comes right after the chapel scene. And remember, he has hesitated to kill Claudius because Claudius seemed to be asking for God's forgiveness for his sins. After Hamlet leaves, having not killed Claudius, Claudius goes on to say, oh, this is not working. My prayers are not working. He's not really sincere. I mean, what would he have to do if he were truly, truly, truly sorry for his sins and truly wanted God's forgiveness? He'd have to confess what he's done, and he would have to give up being king. The very least is he'd have to go into exile. Okay? Maybe he would suffer execution. But at the very least, he'd have to go into exile. So he's not willing to do any of those things, is he? He's not willing to give up his position, his power, his wife. And so then Hamlet goes to Gertrude's bedroom. And who's in the bedroom with her? Polonius is in the bedroom. And Polonius says he's going to hide now behind a tapestry, wall hanging, right? Does Hamlet know who's behind there? I mean, he's obviously going to find out that somebody's behind there. Does Hamlet know who is behind there? Because what happens is that Hamlet starts getting really worked up in the scene with his mother. And again, physically violent, not verbally violent, certainly, but physically violent, not in the sense that he's hitting her or anything like that, but he's shaking her. I mean, he's physically shaking her, okay, in various versions of this. And he's yelling at her, that look at what you have done. You see, you have participated in this incestuous marriage. How could you do this? Look at this picture of my father, your former husband. How could you possibly, after having been married to him, now have married this person, this Claudius? And he even wants to go on, of course, and begin to suggest things about the killing. Well, at some point where he's really, really getting carried away, she is shouting. He's shouting, and she shouts. And here's Polonius behind the tapestry. And he starts shouting, right? And what does Hamlet do? Yeah, he stabs him through the tapestry with his sword, kills him. And then when he drags his body out, what does he say?
Idiot.
Well, yeah, idiot, yeah, right. But what does he say?
Doesn't he ask if it's the king?
Yeah, is it the king? Is it the king? That's the first thing. And then when he drags him out, what does he say to now the dead body of Polonius? Thou rash, intruding fool, I took thee for thy better. Now, who's the better in the court? The king, exactly. Because Polonius's position is what in the court? He's a kind of chancellor over the kingdom. Now, kings didn't always rule. I mean, kings weren't every day in there, you know, taking care of the business of running the country. I mean, there's an enormous amount of stuff that needs to be done. Papers signed, meetings to be held, all kinds of things that need to be done in governing a country. Well, the king can't keep up with all of that kind of stuff and also do the other things that a king is called upon to do. So kings frequently have somebody who's a kind of second in command who will take care of the day-to-day business. And one of the terms for a second in command like that is a chancellor. So that's what Polonius is. You see, and the only person who would be the better of Polonius would be the king, or, well, the queen, perhaps, but the queen's just right there. Obviously, you know, Hamlet's not going to be that confused. So why would he have stabbed through the arras now and killed the person whom he thought was Claudius? Why would he do that now? Yeah.
I would just think because it was just emotional at that time, since he was having the argument, it just kind of, I don't know, built up too much.
Okay, okay. He certainly is very emotional. That's true. And he acts seemingly on a kind of impulse. That's true too. But what other motive would there be? He just hesitated in the previous scene and didn't kill Claudius. Why would he now kill Claudius?
Would it be because he's in the bedroom with his mother?
Yes, exactly, exactly. Because one of the things that he had said when he hesitated to kill Claudius earlier is, I want to catch him in some sinful act, such as posting to incestuous sheets, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so if Claudius has gone to her bedroom, presumably, you know, this is, you know, if not directly to have sexual relations, I mean, that's the context within which sexual relations would take place. Okay, and so he now has caught him in a context which confirms his sin. And so he stabs, thinking that he's killing Claudius. And then he goes back. He just drops Polonius there, and he goes back to his mother, right? And keeps after his mother. And of course, now she is really, really, really shaken up. And what happens? What happens then? What interrupts the scene?
The ghost of his father comes back.
The ghost of his father comes back. And so he changes completely, doesn't he? And he says to his mother, don't you see? And she's saying, wait a minute, what's happening here? What's happening? What are you doing? And he says, well, don't you see it? Don't you see it over there? And the way that's usually done in film is to cut back and forth, so that when Hamlet is looking, the ghost is there, then when she's looking, she doesn't see anything at all. Well, obviously you can do that in film. On stage, you've got to find some different way of handling that. So, how does she react? How does she react to that? Up to that point, she was actually being convinced by her son that she was committing some kind of serious sin. Not the least of which would be in marrying her brother-in-law, and therefore technically committing incest. But now what happens? Yeah. She thinks he's crazy. Right. I mean, that's what crazy people may do sometimes, is they think they see things that aren't there. I mean, that's one of the possibilities, at any rate. And so she tends to discount what he has been saying. It's not that it's not true, but she tends to discount this because she can dismiss him. Well, people are right. You know, he's out of his mind. What does he say in parting? He tries to get her to agree to what? To not sleep with Claudius, yeah. And, you know, you find some reason to turn him down one time, and then the next time it'll be easier, and then the next time it'll be easier still, and so forth. Okay? So, that presumably would satisfy Hamlet, or so he says to her. But notice in this scene, one of the things that we can ask is, well, how mentally stable is Hamlet? First of all, he impulsively stabs, maybe he does think it's Claudius, but he stabs through the tapestry, you know, killing somebody without even actually seeing the person. On the other hand, who else would be in Gertrude's bedroom at night? Presumably fairly late at night. Okay? He certainly gets very emotionally worked up in everything that he's shouting at her, and he's shaking her and all the rest of it. Okay? Does he see the ghost? We may have reason to believe that he sees the ghost, but she doesn't see the ghost. Earlier on, Horatio and the guards had seen the ghost, right? I mean, it wasn't just Hamlet who saw the ghost, but the guys who had been out there on guard duty for the last few nights had seen the ghost first, and then they tell Horatio, and then they all go and tell Hamlet. And that's what gets Hamlet up there to actually have his encounter with the ghost. So in this scene, the only confirmation we have of the reality of the ghost is Hamlet's statement. But in this case, we don't have her statement. Why would the ghost actually appear in one case and not appear in another case? Or is it simpler to believe that the ghost is really there? It's just that the ghost can't be seen by Gertrude for whatever reason. Yeah.
Well, at the beginning when Hamlet has his first encounter with the ghost and the ghost is telling him about what has occurred, he does tell him don't hold it against your mother. I can't remember the exact words,
right.
But don't harm
leave
your
her
mother.
to heaven.
Yeah, leave her alone. So when Hamlet was getting that violent, I kind of thought about that, and the ghost could have come in to remind him not to hurt his mother.
That's a very good point. Yeah, that is a very good point. Because it's true that Hamlet Sr., her former husband, did say to Hamlet Jr., the hero of the play, you know, go after Claudius, hammer and tongs, but leave her to heaven. Let God decide about her. Okay? And if she has sinned, well, let God deal with that. That's not our business. So that would make sense out of that. Yeah, you're right. You're right. We have another mad scene too, don't we? Actually, it's two mad scenes, but people usually lump them together. And that's the one in which Ophelia has now lost her mind. Why?
Well, first you could say lover, but first her lover betrays her, yells at her and screams at her and freaks her out, and then he kills her father.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, right. I mean, it's not just that her father died. I mean, that would be unsettling enough for anybody. But here, the man with whom she has had this very, very close and intimate and loving relationship is the one who has violently killed her father. Okay? As well as insulting her in various ways along the way. Like in the play within the play scene, when he comes over to her and he wants to sit between her legs and he makes all kinds of sexual innuendos in front of everybody else, by the way. This is not private talk. Okay, so he's insulting her in public. So when he talks about having in mind country matters and so forth. But then in Ophelia's mad scene, how does she behave? How does she behave? Remember what I said earlier about how one of the tests of whether or not people are mad is whether they behave out of character. And by out of character, I mean we've seen Ophelia in earlier scenes, haven't we? So we've established certain things about her character. How does she behave here? Well, out of character, yes, but how specifically?
She's singing silly songs. She's giving people flowers, and I know the flowers are very symbolic, but she's really kind of silly.
Okay, she's really kind of silly, and what else? Some of the things that she is saying are sexual double entendre, that is to say, terms that have double meanings, and clearly in this scene, are to be taken in a kind of sexual sense. Well, that's not our Ophelia, is it? I mean, our Ophelia up to that point has been this sweet, innocent young girl, right? Does anybody know how this is handled in the Mel Gibson version? Anybody seen the Mel Gibson version? Remember? Yeah, do you remember that? Okay. First of all, look at her hair. I always say, when people ask me, well, what should we be looking at? I said, well, look at people's hair, look at the makeup, look at the costuming, things like that. All of these are parts of the production of Hamlet, right? And interpretation. So up until that time, notice she has been played. In that version, she's played by Helena Bonham Carter. And, she's been played as this very sweet but savvy, young woman. And here, her hair is all disarrayed. She's got on this, old gray kind of rag that she's wearing. And she comes out to the guard. Okay, there's a soldier standing guard. You remember that scene? And she starts taking this leather thong of, which is part of his uniform, and she starts stroking it. This is around his waist, and she starts stroking it and sort of fondling him and so forth. Well, that's the way Zeffirelli and Bonham Carter have chosen to initiate that scene. Well, it's outrageous, right? I mean, that's not her. So clearly she must be out of her mind. Then there's the question of, how does she die? How does she die, by the way? Right, but we don't know whether she actually commits suicide or not. She is treated by the priest at the funeral and the graveside as if it is possible that she committed suicide. He says that her death was doubtful, And under the rules of the church, there could not be the full ceremony given to someone who had committed suicide. I mean, he goes as far as he thinks he can within the rules of the church. But there are some things he feels he can't do because her death was doubtful. But we don't really know whether she simply fell into the stream or she jumped into the stream. And then as her clothes become waterlogged, you know, they become heavier and heavier and heavier, and she's pulled under the surface of the water and she drowns. Well, what is the point in terms of the development of the play of having her, first of all, go mad and then die, whether she kills herself or not? What does that make possible or even make happen in the plot? Who comes in and sees this? I mean, you've got the king and the queen, and maybe some people from the court around, but who comes in and sees this? Who? No, Hamlet's away. I'm talking about the mad scene. Her brother! Exactly. Her brother comes in. Now, her brother has come back from Paris. He's a student. He comes back from Paris. Why? Because he gets the news that his father has been killed. So you have the parallelism of two sons whose fathers have been killed. Okay? And of course, he's absolutely outraged, and he wants to take vengeance on Hamlet. But the point at which he comes in is the point at which he sees Ophelia, right? So not only has his father been killed by Hamlet's own hand, but now, look, as a result, she's out of her mind. And then later, when she dies in uncertain circumstances, who's going to be held accountable? Hamlet, right? Once again. So that's going to make Laertes susceptible to Claudius's scheme, right? I mean, you've got to provide your characters with motives, don't you? I mean, you're the director of the play. Okay, think of that for a moment. You know, this is going to be a college production, or maybe you're a high school teacher, and you know, you've been assigned the job of directing the senior play. Okay, these are the kinds of things that you have to be talking to the actors about, right? People have to have reasons for their actions, usually, in plays. Especially the principal characters. You know, so you have to provide adequate or plausible motivation for Laertes. And so that's part of what's going on in that scene. So he becomes susceptible, of course, to Claudius's scheme. But in the meantime, he's had an encounter with Hamlet. What's the encounter with Hamlet? Remember that? After she dies, and he knows now that she's died, obviously, and before Claudius approaches him with the scheme to kill Hamlet.
In the graveyard, when Hamlet comes back and he sees that she's died, and Laertes is in the grave screaming for his dead sister, and Hamlet jumps in there and they start fighting. Right.
And I loved her more than, 10,000 brothers? And so you think that they're really going to go at it right then and there. But of course they are parted. You know, guards, soldiers step in and part them. Okay, so then we go into the final scene, and there's something very interesting there. If we don't have enough time left today, I'll get into this at the beginning of our next class. But here's the point I want to get at. Different directors and actors have handled this in different ways. Does Gertrude know that Hamlet is going to be done in, or that there's a plot to do in Hamlet? You know, first of all, with what? The poisoned wine, right? Claudius takes a jewel and he puts it in there, but the jewel apparently has been covered with poison, so that when Hamlet drinks from the cup, then of course Hamlet's going to be poisoned. But not leaving it at that, they also have come to the scheme, he and Claudius and Laertes, that Laertes is going to be fighting with a sword that doesn't have a tip on it. I don't know if any of you have ever done any fencing or not, but the foils or sabers or whatever that you use in fencing, I'm talking about the sport of fencing now, you know, you have a tip on there. And, you know, it hurts a little bit, you can get bruised a little bit, but you're not going to be killed when you're struck with it. Well, in this case, Laertes is going to be fighting without a tip. And even beyond that, he has gotten some poison also and puts it on the tip. Well, a number of questions come up in the scene itself. And by the way, different productions handle that scene differently. You have to have the fight, because there is a fight. I mean, right here in the text of the play, they're having a fight. But how that is actually handled is done differently in different productions. And one of the issues that comes up is the question of whether or not Gertrude knows that the wine is poisoned, and therefore she drinks it, at least in part, to save her son from being poisoned. Now that's certainly the way Olivier has that scene done. Is that the way other people have the scene done, like Branagh or Zeffirelli or Klein or others? Well, that's something that we can be talking about in our next session, when we'll come back for our final conversation about Hamlet before we move on. Okay.